They say going home changes you. What they don't say is that sometimes it changes you in the worst ways, shrinks you down, squeezes you back into a version of yourself you worked years to grow out of. That is just exactly what happened the second I stepped into my Father S house for the first time in 7 years. "Claire," Karen said without standing, "you actually came." She was perched on a kitchen bar stool, wine glass in hand, manicured fingers curled loosely around the stem like it was part of her anatomy. That same tight-lipped smile she wore the day she married my father had never once cracked. "I hope the bus wasn't too crowded," she added. I had driven 6 hours in my own car. I didn't correct her. The house looked exactly the same. Same faded beige carpet, same framed motivational quotes hung along the hallway. Success is earned. Discipline builds legacy. None of them were crooked, of course. Karen's world didn't allow for that. My younger stepbrother Evan was getting married the next day. The house buzzed with excitement. Floral deliveries, catering calls, garment bags hung from curtain rods. But I wasn't part of it. I wasn't offered a drink. No one asked how the drive was. My suitcase sat in the hallway like a forgotten delivery box. I stood in the same entryway where I used to hang my backpack after school, and for a moment, I felt like I was 17 again. Unwelcome, unseen. I found my way to the guest room, my old bedroom, technically. It looked more like a storage closet now. A treadmill leaned against the wall, partially covered by a plastic bag of artificial wreaths. The bed was made up in the same floral spread from middle school, faded and lumpy. At dinner, they all gathered under the chandelier like it was a scene from a glossy lifestyle ad. Evan sat next to his fiancée, Madison, who had that glowing, airbrushed look of someone whose life had never required late-night ramen or second jobs. Karen was beaming. My dad leaned in, proud and present in a way I had rarely seen growing up. They talked about Evan S.'s job, how he was leading the operational integration of a $900 million acquisition. "He's only 28, Karen gushed. "Can you believe that?" "I can," I said softly. No one heard me. My father swirled the wine in his glass. "Evan's always had that drive, that special something. Not everyone's cut out for business leadership, Claire, but that's okay. We all have our roles in life." I said nothing. I'd heard the script before, knew every beat by heart. Then Madison turned to me, all politeness and unfamiliarity. "What do you do again, Claire?" Before I could open my mouth, Karen jumped in. "Claire works with electrical systems. She's very hands-on, good with tools." There it was. "She's the mechanic," someone added. Maybe one of Madison's cousins. I couldn't tell. Laughter. Not cruel, not sharp, just careless. "Actually," Karen said, lifting her glass, "if anything goes wrong at the venue tomorrow, we'll know who to call, right?" More laughter. I looked at my dad. He was smiling into his wine like it was the cleverest thing he'd heard all night. Evan didn't even glance up from his phone. And in that moment, I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver. The kind that settles deep and quiet in your chest, like something has been cut loose and you are just now realizing it's gone. I had once worked maintenance for the Boston subway system. That part was true. I'd done that while taking night classes, scraping by, building something out of nothing. But that had been 10 years ago. Now I worked for the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. I was a senior investigator. I handled high-level audits on mergers and acquisitions. I knew the language of risk, of compliance, of billion-dollar consequences. But I'd never told them. Not because I was ashamed, but because they'd never once asked. Later that night, I sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring at the same wallpaper I had picked out when I was 12. Faded stars and moons now peeling at the corners. I opened my laptop just to breathe, to remind myself that the world outside this house still existed. And there it was. A new email. Subject line, urgent. New assignment notification. I clicked. Tomorrow morning, I was to report in person to initiate a pre-merger audit of Norwin Systems, the same company Evan was merging with. I reread the assignment 3 times, then leaned back in the creaky desk chair and stared at the wall. I would be leading the SEC's investigation. I would be the one signing off or halting the deal. They had no idea. Not my father, not Karen, not Evan, who sat smug and golden under that chandelier, sipping red wine like the world bent to meet his ambition. I'd spent years trying to get them to see me, not just tolerate me, see me. but they only ever remembered the girl who came home with grease-stained sleeves and a secondhand toolbox. Tomorrow, they'd see something else. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I had stopped hiding. Because at 9:02 a.m., I wouldn't be the mechanic. I'd be Claire Donovan, SEC senior investigator. And Evan's entire career, it was about to land squarely on my desk. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of nerves, not even because of anger. I think it was the realization, heavy and strange, that I had crossed some invisible threshold. And once I stepped into that boardroom tomorrow, nothing about this family or my place in it would ever be the same. They still thought I was someone else. They had no idea what I carried into rooms when I walked through the door. At 6:12 a.m., I got up, made coffee in silence, and slipped out of the house while the others were still asleep. My suit jacket was tucked carefully over my arm. My badge and files were in my tote. I didn't bother to leave a note. The drive to Norwin's corporate office took 25 minutes. The morning sky was gray, low with clouds. The kind of weather that makes everything feel suspended, like the air is holding its breath. When I stepped into the lobby, a receptionist looked up and smiled. SEC? I nodded. She buzzed me through without hesitation. I was led to a glass-walled conference room, cold water bottles on the table, notepads, a TV screen already casting the company logo. Evan wasn't there yet, but I was early on purpose. I laid out my documents, scanned the digital agenda, reviewed the preliminary red flags that had triggered our audit request. A few minor discrepancies, compensation structures, board conflicts, private vendor overlaps, but nothing explosive. Still, I knew how these things worked. When companies this size moved too fast, mistakes weren't just possible, they were inevitable, and sometimes they were intentional. At 9:01 a.m., the door opened. Evan stepped in with two men in tailored suits and a woman I recognized from one of Madison S. bridal photos, someone from Norwin S. executive team. He saw me and paused, just for a second, not enough for anyone else to notice. Then he recovered. "Claire," he said with a polite nod. "Didn't realize you were attending." I stood and extended a hand. "Actually, I'll be leading the audit," I said. "Senior Investigator Donovan, pleased to see you again." His face barely moved, but his eyes, they flicked. Fast, calculating. The room quieted. One of the men stepped forward. "Ms. Donovan, we've set aside all requested files. Would you like digital or printed copies?" "Both," I said. "And I'll need access to internal compliance records and all communications regarding merger terms from the last 90 days. "Of course," he replied. Evan sat down slowly, like the floor had shifted beneath him. I began the meeting with a standard briefing, outlining our protocols, expectations, and confidentiality terms. I didn't look at Evan. Not yet. But I felt the weight of his attention. When we finally broke for a short recess, he cornered me outside the conference room. "What is this?" he asked under his breath. "An SEC audit," I said. "Standard for a deal of this size." "You're assigned to us?" "I was assigned yesterday." "You should have said something." I met his eyes. "You never asked what I did." He didn't respond. I stepped back into the room, and that was the moment it began to turn. Subtly. Quietly. But it turned. Because I wasn't the girl at the dinner table anymore. I wasn't the tag-along sister who could be dismissed with a smirk. I was the gate. The next hour unfolded like a careful game of chess. I asked questions, took notes, cross-referenced statements with internal documents. The room shifted with every minute. Posture changed, tones adjusted. Everyone started addressing me directly, except Evan. He sat back, silent, watching, waiting for an opening that never came. By the time we adjourned for the day, we had barely scratched the surface. "We'll resume tomorrow morning," I said, stacking my files. "Thank you for your cooperation." I stepped outside into the gray light, exhaled slowly, and let it hit me. The strange electric calm of standing exactly where you belong, even when no one thought you'd make it there. Back at the house, it was chaos. Hair appointments, champagne flutes, someone arguing over boutonniere colors in the living room. Karen saw me walk in, glanced at my outfit, a pressed blazer, flats, clean makeup, and narrowed her eyes. "Job interview?" she asked. "No," I said. "Work." She tilted her head. "Where at?" I held her gaze for a moment, then smiled. "Downtown." I walked past her before she could ask more. At dinner, they were too busy rehearsing the reception schedule to ask why I'd missed the rehearsal. Evan barely looked up, but I caught the tightness in his jaw, the way his hand lingered too long on the wineglass stem. He was rattled, not because of what I'd said, because of what I hadn't. I spent the rest of the night in my room, cross-checking files, sending updates to my team, and flagging 2 potential irregularities in the compensation disclosures. They weren't smoking guns, but they were warm. The next morning, I returned to Norwin S. office with a list of questions and a confidence I hadn't felt in years. Not just because I was good at my job, but because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn a place at their table. I had my own, and it came with a badge. I arrived 15 minutes early again. There's power in being first, in being prepared before anyone else even walks in the room, in controlling the silence before it becomes conversation. I sat at the same glass conference table, flipping through the reports I'd flagged the night before. 2 anomalies stood out. One was a vendor contract issued without board approval, a shell company tied to a consulting firm that, on paper, seemed legitimate. But the timing didn't sit right. It had been inserted 3 days before the merger announcement. The other was a severance clause buried deep in the revised executive agreements, structured to trigger in case of acquisition disruption, with payouts that totaled over $7 million. I had seen this kind of maneuver before. A golden parachute. Preemptive. Quiet. Designed to bleed. And more often than not, it meant someone expected the deal to fail. At 8:57 a.m., the team trickled in. Executives, analysts, counsel. Evan came in last. He looked rested, dressed sharper than the day before. The kind of polished surface you wear when you rehoping no one looks underneath. We started with internal operations, asset breakdowns, organizational maps, quarterly projections. Then I asked to see the Norwin Systems integration plan. One of the CFOs handed me a thick binder. I flipped to the back. Appendix D, I said. Where's the timeline for foreign subsidiary restructuring? They paused. Evan cleared his throat. We're finalizing that next week. I nodded slowly. You're presenting final terms for acquisition this Friday. Restructuring isn't a post-signing detail, especially when foreign branches are involved. He shifted. The others stayed silent. I kept going. Has the board reviewed the new executive severance terms? More silence. Evan's jaw tightened. We're in the process of circulating updates. I let that hang in the air. I'd like those board minutes by noon, I said, and copies of the consulting contracts approved since April 1st. Someone scribbled a note. Another glanced at Evan. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the tension coming off him in waves. He'd expected me to be a formality. He was starting to realize I wasn't. At lunch, I took my break alone, not out of distance, but out of control. I wanted the silence again. I needed the space to think. I sat in a nearby cafe with a turkey sandwich and a legal pad, reviewing the shell vendor that had caught my eye. Kelmar Holdings. No website, no public-facing presence, registered in Delaware. I pulled its tax ID from the invoice and ran it through our system. It matched a consultancy Evan had invested in 2 years ago. Technically separate, ethically murky, especially if he was using it to push fees through the merger pipeline. When I returned to the conference room, I placed the file quietly on the table in front of him. Quick question, I said. Why is Kelmar Holdings listed as a retained vendor for IT systems when they haven't existed publicly until 6 weeks ago? Evan didn't move. The room did. Eyes darted. He reached for the file, flipping through it slowly. I'm not sure, he said carefully. I'd have to ask legal. Don't bother, I said. We've already flagged it. I'll be submitting a request for deeper review by end of day. He looked up at me for the first time, and I saw it in his face. The beginning of panic, well hidden behind a thin smile. But I knew that smile. I'd seen it before, in every boardroom I'd ever walked into as the only woman under 35. It meant this wasn't supposed to happen. By 4 p.m., the audit was no longer casual. My badge was no longer background. And Evan? He could no longer ignore the fact that the one person his family had spent years talking down to was now the only person in the building who could halt a $900 million deal. When the day ended, I drove back to the house slowly. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the road. I passed the country club where Karen had once taken me for brunch and introduced me as Robert S. Little Girl, the one who likes engines. I remembered the sting of that day, the pitying smiles, the way no one asked follow-up questions. They'd decided who I was long ago, and I had spent years letting them. When I walked into the house that evening, it was filled with flowers. Roses, lilies, orchids, arranged and photographed for the rehearsal dinner. Karen hovered over the caterers. My dad stood by the fireplace, sipping scotch like a man who had finally achieved perfection. Madison was posing for photos in the backyard, all teeth and diamonds. No one noticed I was late. No one asked how work had gone. I slipped upstairs, changed into a simple black dress, and returned just as the speeches were beginning. Evan stood at the head of the table, hand resting on Madison's shoulder. "I've been blessed," he said, "to find a woman like Madison, and to be raised in a family that taught me how to build, how to lead, how to win." Applause. I sipped my water. Karen chimed in next. "Evan's always been the golden boy," she said with a laugh. Even as a child, he had this brilliance about him. So focused, so visionary. She looked across the table at me, raised her glass slightly. "And Claire," she added, "our quiet rock. Always good with her hands." Another laugh. Even Madison chuckled. "And my father?" He didn't even blink. They still didn't see it, still didn't see me. And I realized then, in that moment, I didn't need them to. I didn't come home to be seen. I came home to do my job. And my job was about to make sure Evan's little empire never made it past Monday. When I walked into Norwin's conference room the next morning, the air was different. Tighter. Quieter. People looked up faster. Conversations stopped sooner. Even the receptionist gave me a double take when I passed her desk, like she had been briefed to expect someone more dangerous than I looked. Evan was already there, sitting at the head of the table, flipping through a printed contract that I knew by heart. The sleeves of his dress shirt were rolled up. There was no tie. His jaw was clenched like it had been for hours. I didn't greet him. I just sat down, opened my file, and said, "Let's begin." The first 40 minutes were dry. Policy review, compliance checklists, legal disclosures. But I was waiting for the pivot. And at 10:14 a.m., I made it. I slid a packet across the table. It landed directly in front of him. "This is an itemized summary of internal transfers made between the primary acquisition account and third-party consulting firms in the last 60 days. He barely glanced at it. "Your point?" My voice didn't waver. 4 of those firms are inactive. 1 was registered 2 weeks after the acquisition announcement. 2 are owned by individuals tied directly to Norwin's outgoing leadership. And this one, I tapped a line on the page, is owned by you. Silence. "I invested in Kelmar years ago," Evan said quickly. "It's fully disclosed. The firm is separate from Norwin, no conflict." I nodded. "Except it was used to invoice over $400,000 in advisory fees tied to a merger you orchestrated." I let the number sit in the room for a beat. "Which means," I added, "you profited from a deal you're also the principal on. That's a violation of SEC Ethics Code 204.3. 1. Someone coughed. The woman from Norrin's side, the one with the bridal shower smile, slowly closed her laptop. "Are you accusing me of fraud?" Evan said finally. "I'm identifying irregularities," I replied. "Our team will determine whether they constitute fraud." His mouth opened slightly, like he was going to argue. But he didn't. He just sat back in his chair and stared at the table, hands folded like a man trying very hard not to break them. By noon, the entire energy had shifted. No more jokes, no more pleasantries. People addressed me with full titles. Everyone watched what they said. And Evan, he didn't say much at all. At 1:30 p.m., I made the final request. "We'll need a temporary hold on the acquisition until our internal review is complete." "You can't do that," Evan said quietly. "You don't have that kind of authority." I looked directly at him. "I do." And then, as calmly as if I were asking for a refill on my coffee, I added, "You'll receive formal notice by end of day." That was it. A $900 million deal, frozen midair. Not canceled, just paused, stalled. In the world of mergers, that's all it takes to kill momentum. To scare investors. To shift power. To ruin timing. I stood, collected my materials, and thanked everyone for their time. Evan didn't move. He just stared out the window, lips tight, fists clenched, shoulders high. He looked exactly how I used to feel. Small, powerless, trapped. And the strange thing, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I just felt still. Back at the house, no one asked where I'd been. Karen was too busy directing a hair and makeup crew. My dad was in the den, watching golf with a scotch in hand. Madison was rehearsing her vows out loud in the backyard, voice sing-songy and perfect. I went upstairs and changed for the rehearsal dinner. Black pants, navy blouse, no makeup. I wasn't performing for anyone. Not anymore. At the restaurant, they seated me at the far end of the table, next to one of Madison-esque great-aunts who asked me twice if I worked in car repair. I smiled politely. Not anymore, I said. I work in oversight. I looked across the table at Evan. He didn't meet my eyes. He looked pale, sweating. Madison leaned into him, whispering something in his ear. He nodded, or tried to. He looked like someone trying to hold a life together with paper clips. Karen made another toast. Something about family and legacy and knowing your worth. I didn't flinch, not even when she said my name. Claire, of course, has always been our quiet force, she said. Never needed much, always doing her own thing. We've never really understood what she does, but we know she works hard. The table chuckled. I didn't. I just looked down at my glass and smiled, because in that moment, they still didn't know. They still didn't understand that the reason Evan couldn't eat his dinner, the reason my father kept checking his phone, the reason the wedding planner was whispering urgently to Karen in the corner was because I had frozen the deal, because I was the one who could shatter their precious legacy with a single recommendation, and I hadn't even raised my voice. When the night ended, I rode back to the house alone. Evan stayed behind with the groomsmen. Karen didn't say goodnight. My father didn't look up from his phone. I didn't care. I stood on the front porch for a moment before going inside, listening to the sound of crickets, cars in the distance, and something deeper. My own breath. Steady, calm, unapologetic. I wasn't the girl who needed to be seen anymore. I was the woman who already saw herself. And that was enough. The morning of the wedding, the house felt different. Not festive, not buzzing, just brittle. Like someone had dropped a glass vase and pressed it back together with tape, hoping no one would notice the seams. Karen moved through the kitchen with military precision, snapping orders at the florist on the phone. No, we said white roses, not cream, white. This is not a tea party. Madison's bridesmaids whispered upstairs. There was laughter, but it was thin, forced. And Evan was nowhere. I sipped my coffee slowly, seated at the same kitchen table where I once ate cereal as a kid, before Karen redecorated the whole house to look like a catalog page. My father appeared eventually, tie half done, phone pressed to his ear. He stopped when he saw me, lowering his voice but not hanging up. Yes, I saw the hold notice. No, I didn't realize it was tied to her. I'll call you back. He ended the call and just looked at me. Not angry, not smug, just studying. Like he was trying to read the fine print on someone he'd never actually looked at before. You never said you worked for the SEC? He said. You never asked. He nodded once, like that answer had landed somewhere deeper than he expected. Evan's having a rough morning? He added. The Norwin board is spooked. Investors are threatening to pull unless the audit clears by next week. I said nothing. You know he's worked for this. All his life. So have I said softly. He paused. You couldn't have waited? Until after the wedding? I don't make the rules, I said. I just enforce them. He looked like he wanted to argue, or explain, or justify. But instead, he did something I'd never seen him do. He walked away. No retort, no lecture, just quiet. By noon, Evan still hadn't arrived at the venue. Karen was pacing in her heels, barking into her phone. Where the hell is he? The photographer's on a schedule? Madison was sitting alone in the bridal suite, mascara wand frozen midair, staring at her phone with her mouth slightly open. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. He told me it was just a delay, she said. He didn't tell me. It was because of you. Everyone looked at me. I didn't flinch, because by then, I wasn't the punchline anymore. I was the plot twist. Eventually, Evan arrived. Tie crooked, eyes red, jaw locked. He didn't speak to me, didn't even glance my way, but I could see it, how hard he was holding it together, how the calm, confident man from the rehearsal dinner was now cracking behind the surface. The ceremony went on. Of course it did. Karen wouldn't have allowed anything less. They said their vows under a floral arch that probably cost more than my college tuition. The guests clapped, the music played, photos were taken, but the tension never left. Even the smiles had an edge to them, like everyone was pretending not to notice the fracture running through the middle of the picture. At the reception, I found a quiet corner near the exit. I didn't feel like dancing. I didn't feel like drinking. I just watched. My father stood alone near the bar, looking older than I remembered. Karen was still performing, complimenting outfits and collecting praise for the event, but she kept checking her phone. I knew she was waiting for an update. I knew it wouldn't come. Madison drifted between tables, a perfect bride in a perfect dress, her eyes scanning constantly, looking for reassurance that things hadn't changed. But they had. By the time dessert was served, Evan finally approached me. He didn't smile, didn't sit, just stood there holding a glass of champagne with the stem cracking under his grip. "You did this on purpose," he said. "No," I said. "I did my job." "You embarrassed me in front of everyone." "Funny," I said. "I remember being called the mechanic in front of everyone." He looked away, jaw tight. "I'm trying to fix this," he said. "But now every investor is second-guessing the deal. The board is furious. My job's on the line." I met his eyes. "So is your integrity." He didn't reply, because there was nothing left to say. Eventually, he walked away, and I just stood there, calm, unmoved, holding a glass of water like it was armor. A few minutes later, my father approached, but this time his voice was different. Not loud, not commanding, almost quiet. "You were right," he said. I blinked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't say that often." "No," I said. "You don't." "I underestimated you." I didn't respond. He nodded once. "You were always good at seeing the fine print. I just didn't bother to read it." And then he walked away, leaving me in silence. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest I'd ever get. And somehow, that was enough. By the time the night ended, I was already halfway packed. I didn't wait for morning, didn't leave a note. I just drove. Back to my apartment, back to my life. Back to the world where my name wasn't followed by a scoff or a smirk. 2 days later, I received a call. The merger was frozen indefinitely. A deeper investigation had been launched. More irregularities were found. Evan was pulled from the project. And I got offered a lead promotion. Another assignment. Another case. I said yes, because I was done chasing validation from people who had spent years pretending I was invisible. Now, they saw me. They just didn't know what to do with it. It had been 3 weeks since the wedding. 3 weeks since I froze a $900 million merger. 3 weeks since Evan's name disappeared from Noren's press releases, since the family group chat fell into radio silence, and since I'd stopped checking my phone for updates that never came. I didn't need to watch the fallout, because I wasn't part of it anymore. Instead, I was back at my apartment. Small, quiet, and fully mine. The fridge was still half empty. My inbox was very full, and the plants on my windowsill were finally surviving, which felt like a metaphor for something I couldn't quite put into words. On a Monday morning, I started a new audit. This time, it was a clean one. No scandals, no personal ties, no high-stakes tension. Just numbers, records, and the strange satisfaction that came from digging until the truth showed its face. It was good work. Honest work. I liked who I was when I did it. That Friday, a package arrived at my door. No return address, just my name, printed neatly in a typeface I recognized from my father's old printer. Inside, a photo. Me, Evan, and my dad at a summer barbecue, years ago. I was probably 16. My hair pulled back in a frizzy ponytail, grease on my hands, holding a wrench like it was an extension of my body. I remembered that day. The old Subaru I'd fixed. The way Evan had watched me from a distance, joking about how I was more tomboy than tech. Back then, I'd laughed along. Now, I saw it differently. Also inside the envelope was a handwritten note. You were always more than they gave you credit for. That's on them. Never on you. J. Jessica. Of course. I sent her a text immediately. Did you send that photo? She replied in 3 seconds. Figured you should see how far you've come? I looked at the photo again. Back then, I had something to prove. Now? I didn't. Not to them. Not to anyone. The following weekend, my father called. I stared at the screen as it rang. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel a rush of anxiety. No heat behind my ears, no pressure in my chest, just stillness. I let it go to voicemail. Later, I listened to it once. Claire, just wanted to say congratulations. I heard about the promotion. You've built something impressive. I hope you're doing well. Click. No apology, just acknowledgement. And for once, that was enough. Because I didn't need remorse to move on. I needed me. I went for a walk that evening, down the street near the old bookstore I loved. It had rained earlier, and everything smelled like concrete and lavender. I passed a kid sitting on a stoop, flipping a screwdriver between his fingers. Probably 14, grease on his knuckles. Same spark in his eyes I used to have. I smiled at him. He nodded back, like he recognized something. Later that night, I opened my laptop and started a folder called The Mechanic Files. Inside it, I dropped every piece of writing I'd done on the merger. My notes, my memos, my emails. Then I added a document titled What They Didn't See, not for publication, not for anyone else, just for me. I wrote, they called me the mechanic like it was an insult, like turning a wrench was beneath them, like fixing broken things wasn't a skill. But here's what they never understood. Every tool I ever held taught me how to look deeper, how to listen for things most people ignore. That's what auditing is too. Listening, watching, tuning into the hum of systems most people never think to question. And when something's not working, I know exactly where to look. So yes, I'm the mechanic, the one who saw the whole machine breaking down and had the nerve to shut it off before it caught fire. I saved the file and closed the laptop. There was no revenge, no final speech, just that truth. I didn't need to be invited back to the table. I built a new one, smaller, stronger, with better lighting. 1 week later, I gave a guest lecture at a local college. A young woman raised her hand and asked, "How do you stay confident when everyone in the room assumes you don't belong?" I smiled. I stopped trying to prove them wrong, I said. I just did the work. And eventually, the work spoke louder than I ever could. Afterward, she came up to thank me, said she'd been debating whether to switch to finance from mechanical engineering, said her father didn't think she had the stomach for it. I told her she did, because I'd been her, because I still was her in 1,000 quiet ways. That night, I stood on my balcony, coffee in hand, wind moving through my hair like a whisper. I watched the city lights blink awake one by one and thought about how far I'd come, from the girl in oil-stained jeans to the woman who froze a 9-figure deal with a calm voice and a badge. And not because she wanted to destroy anyone, but because she had finally decided that she mattered more than their approval, that her name was enough. Her title didn't need permission. Her silence was a scalpel. Her presence, the thing they never saw coming. So yes, they called me the mechanic. And I let them, because they had no idea I'd already rebuilt myself from the ground up. And this time, no one gets to strip me down again.